and welcome to all attendees to this in-person and online hybrid workshop, today in Johannesburg, facilitated by the delegation of the European Union to South Africa, on the subject, the implications of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, on South African industry. My name is Chris Yelland, and I am the Managing Director at EE Business Intelligence, and I'll be your Master of Ceremonies for this workshop. The official welcome will be given by the Deputy Ambassador of the European Union Delegation to South Africa, Mr. Fulgencio Garrido Ruiz. So I will not preempt him and steal his thunder. My job is simply to address some housekeeping issues. I will also be facilitating the discussions and the Q&A session and trying to keep this workshop on topic and on time. So we have about 60 delegates attending this workshop in person and about 700 delegates registered to attend the workshop online, which indicates a widespread interest in the topic and perhaps also some anxiety on the road ahead in South Africa. The program for today has been widely circulated, and you'll find it on your desk today, and we've also sent it electronically. The Wi-Fi password for this venue is the word connect me. One word, all lowercase, connect me. And you'll go there and see Capital Empire Hotel, and you can log on to the Wi-Fi in this room. You'll also see signs all around this venue. If you've forgotten the password, connect me, lowercase, one word. So you should have no problems, I hope, in joining us on your laptops and enabling you to communicate and do your normal business while you're watching with us. But please put your phones on silent so that they're not disturbing the rest of the proceedings. The restrooms at this in-person venue at the Capital Empire in Sandton can be found outside of that door over there. So you go out there and you will immediately see the sign for the restrooms. In the case of an emergency, an alarm will sound and you will be asked to leave this venue in an orderly fashion to gather at the assembly point, which is outside the main entrance of the hotel, outside where you came in to the reception area. Please do note that this workshop is being recorded, and there is a photographer present who will be taking pictures for the European Union delegation website and their social media channels. So if you have any issues with privacy, sorry about that, you might have to excuse yourself, but I hope you won't mind that your photograph may be taken. Please note that after the workshop, refreshments and snacks will be served at a networking cocktail function in this adjacent room where you came in and where you grabbed your snacks earlier. Please do stay on at this cocktail party to meet and interact with the European Union delegation, people who are present, our hosts, our presenters, our panelists, and you, the attendees. There are certain snacks marked as halal or vegan, and they have a label on them. So to identify, these are specifically for people who actually ordered halal and vegan. So I would ask you, please, if you did not order it, you'll be eating somebody else's food. So I just wanted to make that little point. The other thing I want to say is that after this event, a feedback report with links to view the workshop proceedings on demand, that is the video recording, and to download the presenter biographies and all the presentations will be made available early next week to all in-person and online registered persons, whether or not they actually attended or not. If they registered, you will get the feedback report. So without further ado, I will now call upon Deputy Ambassador Fulgencio Garrida Ruiz, who will do the official welcome for this workshop and give some opening words to contextualize what this is all about. Now, I'm told that people who know the Deputy Ambassador call him Pencho. So please welcome Deputy Ambassador Pencho. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. You have pronounced my name excellently. Thank you. Thank you very much. Distinguished representatives of South African industry, colleagues, partners here in the room, and also online, a good afternoon to you all. It is a pleasure to welcome you today to discuss the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, as it is known, and the implications that it will have for businesses in South Africa. Let me, before I start, to thank my colleagues, Caroline Tixier and Saleh Kaubi, for the organization of this event. Convening all of us here in this room and hundreds online is not an easy feat, and I would like to recognize the excellent work that they have done. It is also my pleasure to be joined by my colleagues from the European Commission, and in particular, Vicente Hurtado Roa and Klaus Ruerig from the Directorate General for Taxation and Customs Union. Many of you may know them already. You might be familiar with them because they have been engaged over the past 3 years on this subject with South Africa. And that brings me to a point that I would like to stress, and is that today, the event today reflects a sustained commitment of the European Union. Over the past years, we have engaged with you and broader industry, government, civil society, and other stakeholders in events such as this one to raise awareness, to explain concepts, and also to enter into issues related to implementation. And going forward, this is something that we will continue to do. We recognize that CBAM poses a challenge for exporters to the European Union. And it is a topic that South Africa raises with us regularly. That was the case of your national parliament earlier this week during a visit of our European Parliament's delegation on international trade. And it was also the case on recent meetings that we have had with the Minister of Fisheries, Forestries and Environment, or the Deputy Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition. But we are also convinced that CBAM offers a huge opportunity to decarbonize, and in doing so, to ramp up greener industrialization and economic growth. CBAM, as it is conceived, and as we have always explained, is an environmental measure. But it's also clear that in the current context of the vital importance of clean supply chains, CBAM also gives movers an early advantage, a competitive edge. Recently, we have started the implementation of a new tool with South Africa. It is called a Clean Trade and Investment Partnership. And the end of this new tool, this new partnership with South Africa, is to mobilize and facilitate investments and to engage in regulatory cooperation along a series of clean supply chains, amongst them renewable energy, electrification, clean fuels, green hydrogen, and climate and mitigation technologies. And in particular, CTIP, as it is known, this instrument, under it, the European Union and South Africa, they have committed, and I quote, to engage in technical dialogue on the implementation of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism and on carbon pricing policies that promote innovation, sustainable industrialization, and climate targets. And this is what we are doing, for instance, with the National Treasury and other departments of the government of South Africa, providing support to South Africa's carbon tax. And this is a tool that could help South Africa to keep revenues that otherwise would be captured by the European Union and the CBAM. I'd like you might know it already, but I would like to mention nevertheless that a new consultation on the South African carbon tax is ongoing until the 10th of June. Under this consultation, you can shape how the instrument will look like going forward. So our strong recommendation to you is to avail of this opportunity and to participate actively in this open consultation. Besides CTIP, we are also mobilizing and rolling out already a Global Gateway. Global Gateway is the European Union's investment program for the world, our external investment program, and is in support of South Africa's green energy transition and green industrialization ambitions. And together with our European Union member states, we have mobilized up to date nearly 12 billion euro. To give you an order of magnitude, that is around 228 billion rands. What we are doing already is concrete investments into projects along the value chains of minerals and metals, renewable energy, or green hydrogen, as well as infrastructure connectivity, notably on transport and logistics. And this approach, this mix of investments and regulatory cooperation is grounded on a conviction that we felt it very strongly, that decarbonization and economic growth, competitiveness, and job creation can go hand in hand. So we hope that this discussion today will benefit everyone here and online, and that we have a very fruitful engagement. We look forward to your questions, to your insights, and to your continued engagement. With this, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pencho, for those words. It's nice to be informal in this way. So thank you very much for that introduction. And I would like now to introduce to you our first speaker, as it were, who is going to be joining us from Brussels. And that is Mr. Vicento Garrido Rua, who is the unit head Taxud. He is the Director General, Taxation and Customs Union, responsible for CBAM, energy, and green taxation at the European Union in Brussels. So with that, I hope, Vicento, you can hear me and that you are online and ready to deliver your words of wisdom. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. And thanks also to Pencho for the introduction and for the outline on the objectives with CBAM and a bit about the timeline with the implementation of CBAM. As Chris was saying, my name is Vicente Hurtado Roa. I'm the head of unit in Taxud in the European Commission. Unit C2, responsible of CBAM, but also green and energy taxes. And we've been working on the CBAM since the very beginning, already from 2021, when the first proposal was adopted. I'm here today with my colleague, Klaus Rerich. As Pencho also was saying before, he is the one responsible in the international team in my unit for South Africa. So he's following, in particular, your developments on carbon tax, but also, of course, your main concerns and your main issues. Chris mentioned that this workshop has attracted a lot of attention, given the number of participants in the room, but also participants online. He referred to some anxiety. I hope that we will contribute today to tone down this anxiety and to get you closer to CBAM, to the latest news and latest developments, and of course, to understand a bit better how CBAM will impact on you. It's not the first time that we reach out to such a big audience in South Africa. I think I was lucky to be there 1 year ago. It was February 2025. Since then, we didn't have the pleasure to go back. We were in Pretoria discussing with your authorities in the different departments. And we were also in Sandton, near Johannesburg, also in an event that was also very interesting, and that was also a possibility to reach out today. But since then, things have happened, things have been developing, and in particular, and the most important is that the definitive period with implementation of CBAM with financial obligations already started on the 1st of January 2026. So we finished with the transitional period that brought us until the end of 2025, where we were only collecting data from importers and also from exporters in order to fine-tune the system and in order to come with possible simplifications. This is why last year we already came with a number of simplifications. You possibly heard about this rule of the 50-ton threshold. So those imports that do not reach, or those importers that import less than 50 tons of all CBAM goods, excluding hydrogen and electricity, which are of a very different nature. In that case, they don't need to comply with the obligations. They don't need to buy CBAM certificates. They don't need to report at the end of the year. I think it's important to say also that even if we started on the 1st of January 2026 with financial obligations, and imports from that date are subject to CBAM, however, the obligations will all come in 2027. And the obligations are mainly on the importers in the EU. That's important to clarify. The importers are the ones who have to buy CBAM certificates according to the embedded emissions, CO2 embedded emissions in the imported goods, and they also have to report by September of every year. So the first reporting will be in September 2027, the imports that were made in the previous year, and surrender the necessary certificates to cover those emissions. But this is one part of the truth, because the other part, of course, is that depending on whether they will be declaring emissions based on default values that we published last year, country by country, good by good, or whether they want to rely on the actual emissions, so on the real emissions embedded in the imported goods, then they will need your help and your support. They will need, in particular, that you monitor and report your emissions, that will need to be verified by an external independent verifier, and these emissions will be taken into account for the calculation of the CBAM liability. If this is not possible, they will have to rely on default values, and I will be completely transparent with you. The default values are sufficiently high because they try to cut some sort of average of the most polluting production route in every country, and they can be penalizing for most of you who are, in particular, doing your green transition, introducing green technologies, and reducing your emissions. So we can understand that most of you, in particular those who are interested in CBAM, are also interested in calculating their actual emissions and sharing those values with importers in the EU. I will come back to that at the very end of my presentation, because I think it's important that I underline this issue. I would also like to say that by the end of the year, by the end of last year, 2025, we came with a number of legal text that provides the way how we calculate the liability. For example, the methodology for actual emissions, but also the default values, also the benchmarks for free allocation. As you possibly know, from 26 to 2034 in the EU ETS, which is the carbon price in place in the EU, some of the emissions are covered by free allowances, so they don't pay carbon price. And these benchmarks are also recognized for imported goods. If you have questions about that, because that becomes a bit technical, we can reply to your questions at the end of the presentation. So the thing is that all these numbers were clarified and published last year. The only thing that has not been published yet, and we are working on that, and Pencho mentioned, is the implementing act on the carbon price. South Africa has a carbon tax in place, and this carbon tax can be recognized and can be deducted from the liability in the EU. So it will be also important that you also collect the data about the carbon tax paid. This will have to be certified, and this, of course, will have to be transmitted to the importers, who will be able also to claim and to reduce their liability based on this carbon tax. As Pencho said, we launched a public consultation 2 weeks ago. It will be running until the 10th of June. We had a webinar with an expert group last Tuesday, no, actually yesterday, sorry. Yesterday was Wednesday. Yesterday, where some industries, but also third countries, South Africa, participated in this webinar. And I think it's important also that if you are interested, of course, you also provide your feedback. You will find information in our website. Otherwise, the colleagues in the delegation in Pretoria, they will be able to share this information with you. Another point is that although we are starting in 2026, and I said that during a period from 26 to 2034, the impact of CBAM will be lower because of these benchmarks. We also intend to review the regulation next year. And in particular, we will look at the possibilities of extending, on one hand, the CBAM to other basic sectors. Take the example of, I don't know, I don't want to say that this will be done, but we are analyzing, for example, the chemicals, or we are analyzing the ceramics, the glass, I mean, sectors which are intensive in carbon emissions and intensive in trade, therefore subject to the risk of carbon leakage. And we will also be looking at also the extension of emissions, scope of emissions to all sectors, and I'm referring to indirect emissions from the production of electricity. We know that this is something sensitive now in South Africa. We've been discussing this also with Eskom, and there are greening plans for greening electricity production. We know that in South Africa, for the moment, it's mostly coal-based, but of course there are plans to move to more renewables, and that of course will be also recognized. For the moment, we only apply indirect emissions to the cement and to the fertilizer sector. This is not so relevant for you, but of course next year we will take a decision whether we extend also to steel, aluminum in particular, which are sectors which are intensive also in the use of electricity for the production of their goods. Last point about legal developments. As you possibly know, we adopted also a proposal at the end of last year to extend to downstream goods in particular. The proposal also encompasses other issues like, for example, electricity, but this is not relevant for you because you don't export electricity to the EU. But of course, for example, in terms of downstream goods, so goods which are intensive in steel, aluminum, cement, although the criteria are, as for the rest of the goods, of course, carbon intensity and trade intensity mostly. I mean, the idea is that we could also extend the measure to those goods, and then that could be, for example, applicable from 2028. This proposal is still under discussions between Council and Parliament, so we cannot anticipate what will be the final outcome. We hope that there will be an agreement before the end of the year, but I cannot completely reassure you how the extension will be and whether this will be approved before the end of the year. I mean, just to say that even if we extend to downstream goods, it doesn't mean that we will apply the measure on all the emissions for the production of those downstream goods, but only to the content of steel, aluminum, cement in particular, which has been used for the production of those goods. We will try also to simplify as much as possible in order to make sure that we don't bring a lot of administrative burden, or that we keep the administrative burden under control. But just for you to know that this is coming, and I guess that some of you may be also interested in this. Final points, and I would like to insist on two issues. The first thing is, I mentioned before, you can rely on default values, and then you don't need to do anything, or you can rely on actual emissions, and in particular, if you are decarbonizing. I think that's important. I want to encourage you to, of course, rely more and more on actual emissions as you are decarbonizing, reducing your carbon intensity. And for that, you need to monitor your emissions. You need to know and understand the methodology, the CBAM methodology that was published last year. And you also need to already contact with verifiers in order to get verification of your emissions, because you will need to have a verification report. We are now opening the accreditation process to accredit verifiers around the world. The accreditors have to be national accreditation bodies in the EU, established in the European Union. I can tell you that there are already 5 member states or 5 NAPs in the EU which have opened the window for accreditation. However, verifiers can be anywhere in the world. So if you are in the audience, a verifier who have experience in verification of emissions, maybe for the purpose of your carbon tax, consider also offering your services. And we will be happy, of course, to help you and to give you more information in order to do that. So I encourage verifiers to get accreditation from EU NAPs, and I also encourage producers in South Africa to get in contact with possible verifiers. Could be in South Africa, but could also be in the European Union, in order to make sure that you will get verification of your emissions as soon as possible. The sooner you do that, the better for you. You will have an advantage. Pencho referred to that. If you decarbonize your emissions, if you get verification of your emissions, you will have a clear advantage with respect to your competitors, either in South Africa as well, but of course around the world. Because what we see, and I mean, that was also the feedback from the steel industry in South Africa, is that importers in the EU are concerned, of course, with the impact of the CBAM, although at the beginning will be lower, but of course over time will be increasing. And they are already starting to select their suppliers to make sure that they choose the greener possible producers. This is the objective of CBAM in particular. This is an environmental measure. This is a climate measure. Pencho said that, and I would like to insist, and this is the objective. So those of you who will be introducing green technologies, reducing your emissions, will have clearly an advantage. So I encourage you to do that, and more importantly after that is also to make sure that you monitor your emissions, that you get verification of your emissions, and that you share this information with your importers. And with that, I propose that I give the floor to my colleague, Klaus, who has prepared a presentation. The presentation will be distributed to all of you, so no worries with that. And we will be happy to take also questions after the presentations to clarify whatever was unclear, or of course, to elaborate a bit further on those issues. Thank you very much again for this opportunity to reach out to you. For us, it's important, and be reassured that we are here also to help you understand and to help you deal and manage with implementation of CBAM. So, Chris, if you don't mind, we go ahead with the presentation.
Yeah, can I just introduce Klaus? Klaus Rurich is the policy officer at Taxid, also in the European Union, Brussels, from the same division as Vicento. And he is going to give a presentation, which you will see. Klaus, can I please ask you to say next slide when you want us to transition from one slide to the next? And audience, please feel free, the online audience and those in the room, to post any questions on the Zoom Q&A text facility so that we capture your questions and can deal with them both during the presentation as well as thereafter when we go into the Q&A session. So please start posting your questions on the Zoom Q&A text facility. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Klaus to deliver his presentation. Thank you, Klaus.
Yeah, many thanks, Chris, and also thanks, Vicente, and also to the Deputy Ambassador. So welcome from my side. As mentioned already, I'm a policy officer in the Unit C2, dealing with the implementation of CBAM and the contact person also for South Africa. So I will just, based on the opening remarks also of Vicente, go a bit deeper into some of the elements that were already mentioned of where we are with the implementation of CBAM, and also what rules have been adopted now for the definitive periods at the end of last year, which the period started in January this year. So if we move to the next slide, this is just to provide a bit of an overview again on the basic motivation behind CBAM. So as mentioned already, it's an environmental measure. The main purpose of CBAM is to reflect, mirror, and complement the EU emissions trading system, so the carbon pricing instrument that is applied domestically in the EU, and applying this to importers or imported goods. there is a specific element that we will also talk about, which is the adjustment for free allocation. That has also been part of subject to the rules that have been adopted at the end of last year, and which are important in order to ensure this this equal treatment and this mirroring. Then secondly, also important, CBAM now in the definitive period applies CBAM liability. This liability is paid by the CBAM declarant, so by the importer. This is the person ultimately liable and responsible for purchasing CBAM certificates and paying the CBAM liability, which is reflected of the carbon content of the goods that are imported. And then thirdly, this is also part of the CBAM's intention to strengthen carbon pricing in trade partner countries. There is a possibility also of deducting a carbon price already paid in the third countries from the CBAM obligation. Then very important to remember the rules of CBAM. There's one rule that applies to everyone. So the rules are applied horizontally. There's only some technical exemptions that were introduced specifically also last year in the simplification package with the 50-ton annual threshold. And for countries that have fully linked their emissions trading system with the EU ETS. But apart from these exceptions, all CBAM rules apply irrespective of the country of origin of the CBAM goods. And then if we come to the next slide, this is just to clarify again where we are in terms of the sectoral scope that CBAM covers. So by design, all sectors that are covered by the EU emissions trading system would be eligible, but for the moment, only 6 sectors are under the scope of CBAM. So in particular, or these are iron and steel, aluminium, cement, fertilizers, hydrogen, electricity. They've been selected based on the criteria that you can see here on the screen. And there's also a difference in the emission scope to which CBAM applies for these goods. So all goods are covered in terms of their direct emissions. These now, since the beginning of the year, have to be translated or are taken into account in order to determine the embedded emissions and therefore the CBAM obligation. And for 2 sectors, cement and fertilizers, also scope 2 indirect emissions are taken into account. On the next slide, there's a bit of a comparison between the reporting obligations between the transitional period that we had in the last year and a half, during which declarants were asked to report direct and indirect emissions for all sectors, while now in the definitive period, only direct emissions for all sectors and only indirect for fertilizers and cement are being reported or falling under the reporting obligations. As mentioned already by Vicente, there was a reflection whether the sectoral scope of CBAM would be extended or whether the emission scope were to be extended. This was also a reflection that is part of the review report that was published in December last year. But for the moment, and this is also important to note, the current scope of CBAM is remains as it is, with the only exception for the possible extension to downstream products that Vicente already mentioned, which is now in deliberation with the EU co-legislators. Maybe just on, if you come to the next slide, this is just to show a couple of reflections on data already collected during the transitional period. Here we have a list of the most exposed countries for CBAM, also departed by sectors. You see here South Africa as well at the end of the list. And important to note also is on the right side, we have seen during the transitional period a very welcome increase in the share of reports based on actual values. So there we are quite optimistic or quite hopeful that this will also continue during the definitive period, where, as Vicente also mentioned, the design of CBAM is designed in a way to actually incentivize the reporting, monitoring, and use of actual values in CBAM. When we, on the next slide, zoom a bit into the case of South Africa, we see that overall an exposure in terms of the total traded goods in South Africa, we are talking about around 6% of total traded goods. And you can see here the vast majority is really from the metal sector, so from iron and steel and aluminium. We had numbers of 1.2 billion worth in euro traded in 2025, and then split by 668 million for iron and steel and 570 million for aluminium. However, when we look or when we anticipate the downstream scope extension that is currently discussed in the European Parliament and the Council, we also see that South Africa's would be one of the exporters that would also be mostly impacted by that extension. So that's why we also deem it important to continue also the exchange and dialogue with you. Then on the next page, this is just to also show the data collected on South Africa during the transitional period. Mainly here to highlight is also the same trend that we've seen in the increase of reporting based on actual values. And this is particularly the case for large tonnage declarants. So this is on the right side. You can see here that entries over 1,000 tons are really reaching close to 100% in the last quarter of 2025. And again, this is a very positive development that we also then hope indicates continuous reporting based on actual values now in the definitive periods. Then if we are looking on the next slide, just in terms of the timeline, so we have had the transitional periods that ended at the end of last year. We adopted the review report that also had an assessment of the impacts of CBAM specifically on least developed countries. We then adopted, or the Commission adopted, the list of definitive rules applicable for the definitive period as well in December, together with a legislative proposal for the extension of CBAM to downstream products. And then the reflection on an extension of CBAM beyond the current scope in terms of sectors and emission scope will be again or is postponed for now until 2027, until the next review report. Now for the definitive periods, we are looking into the gradual introduction of CBAM. So from 2026 onwards, imports will be subject to the CBAM obligation. This also means that importers of CBAM declarants have to be authorized and registered. And then CBAM liabilities will apply to imports starting from 1st January this year. But the deadline for surrendering certificates and for submitting the CBAM declaration will be only at the end of September 2027. So there is still this time for margin to ensure that monitoring, reporting, and verification can happen in time. And then there's a general revision wave foreseen as well in 2027, when also the implementing rules will be again subject to revision. On the next slide, I'm mentioning a few more elements of the review report, but you're also really encouraged to have a look in depth. Just to mention that we already see that CBAM has been an engine for industrial decarbonization, especially in this kind of tandem function in incentivizing also the uptake of carbon pricing in trade partner countries. And we work very closely there with other European Commission services, in particular DG Klima, that is also supporting partner countries, including South Africa, on the design of carbon pricing mechanisms. And then, as I mentioned already, it also looks into the impact of CBAM with a specific focus on these developed countries. Now we leave a bit the transitional period and we come to the specific rules for the definitive period. So on the next slide, or on the next slides, I will just briefly introduce the main elements on how declarants will calculate the CBAM obligation. So everything starts from the element of determining the embedded emissions, and there are always two general avenues to do this. So one is either based on actual verified emissions. These need to be monitored by the operator in the third country and then verified by an accredited verifier so that the declarant can use those values in the CBAM declaration. If those values are not available, or in order to maybe skip this process of verification, the declarant can always also opt for the use of default values. But as mentioned already, these are set at a level that are rather high, so to incentivize also the verification and the use of actual values. And then the Commission and national competent authorities in the EU are then responsible for reviewing the submitted declarations and also to ensure that emissions were duly verified. I think this presentation will be shared with you. So on the next slides, you will also see links to all the implementing acts with the detailed rules that have been adopted for the definitive periods. So there has been a package that was launched or that was adopted in December. One or a few implementing acts are still being developed right now, specifically the one on the effectively paid carbon price in third countries. There's a public consultation that is currently ongoing and still open until the 10th of June. So also there an invitation to everybody online and also in person to reply to this public consultation. Then the next slide is just to show a representation of the different elements that constitute the calculation for the CBAM liability. So when I say CBAM liability, this is the amount of or the number of CBAM certificates that the CBAM declarant or the importer needs to surrender. And each certificate is expressed as a representation of 1 ton of CO2, the price of which is linked to the price of the EU emissions trading system. So that will determine the overall cost or the overall liability of CBAM. Then the number of certificates is determined by these elements that you can see here in the formula. It all starts with the specific embedded emissions of the goods. Then there can be two deductions. One is for the free allocation residual still in the emissions trading system. This is during a transitional period until 2034, until which we still have free allocation handed out in the EU ETS for CBAM sectors. And then a second deduction is the specific emissions already paid by a carbon price in a third country. And each of these elements are governed by specific rules that are part of specific implementing acts, which you see here and linked as well on the slide. So very briefly on the next slide, again, I think this hopefully is clear by now. For the embedded emissions, we have two fundamental approaches. One, either on the use of actual values. This requires especially the operator in a third country to apply the monitoring and reporting rules. These rules are determined by the so-called methodology implementing regulation that you see here linked. And then in order to be used, these values then have to be verified by an accredited verifier, also under specific rules that are governed by dedicated implementing legislation. Then the operator will need to set up a so-called monitoring plan and an emissions report, and a verifier will then issue or check these calculations and emissions in these reports, and then, if everything is correct, issue a verification report, which then the declarant will add to the CBAM declaration when using actual values. A shortcut, so to say, would be the second avenue, which is to use the default values, and they are determined by country and by CN codes. They are applied also a markup, which increases from year to year for all goods except fertilizer goods. And you will find a very long table with the specific default values in a dedicated implementing act on default values. But again, these were set also in order to ensure that emissions cannot be or are not underestimated. So they are set at a relatively high level, which also then triggers the incentive to use actual values. Then the second element that's on the next slide, the second element just on the free allocation adjustment, just very few words. Just to say that this is an essential element to ensure that there's an equal treatment between EU producers of CBAM goods and imported goods. So the rules that are used for the free handout of allowances under the EU ETS are based on so-called a benchmark approach. So there are different ETS benchmarks applicable that determine the amount of free allocation. And again, CBAM is mirroring this approach as well. So there are specific CBAM benchmarks that are derived from the ETS benchmarks and which are used for the determination of this second element, which can be deducted from the CBAM obligation during the time that we still have free allowances under the EU ETS. And this, for the moment, is until 2034. Then, if we come to the next slides, this is really on the kind of important element, and that is also, of course, the new element now in the definitive period, the verification of emissions, which is now necessary in order to report actual values. This verification takes place at the level of the installation, and then the verifier is hired by the operator. This verifier would then need to check the calculations of the monitoring and reporting of emissions undertaken by the operator, a bit like an audit. And then there is also a visit of the installation foreseen, and then the verifier would issue a verification report that is added to the CBAM declaration. On the next slide, I think you will just see a bit of a summary of what a verifier would need to demonstrate. So we are currently working with the EU national accreditation bodies that are in charge of going through the applications of verifiers. These verifiers can be based anywhere in the world. So also South African verifiers are encouraged to reach out to these EU national accreditation bodies to apply for accreditation. They would just need to demonstrate the knowledge of the respective ISO standards. So that's particularly 14065 and 17029, as well as competence on the CBAM rules, particularly, of course, those related to accreditation verification, but also the monitoring and reporting, and also show proof of independence and impartiality. So I think the next slide shows you a list of the, this still shows you a bit the kind of interaction between what the third country operator would need to do. So preparing the monitoring plan and then monitoring emissions based on the rules in the Methodology Act. Then the verifier would check these calculations and issue a verification report, and then the declarant, when they would want to use actual values, would attach this verification report to the CBAM declaration. the next slide, you will see a list of all the national accreditation bodies. So this is particularly important either if there are verifiers or interested verifiers in the room to reach out to especially those national accreditation bodies that have already opened the application procedure and that are also signaled that they agree to go through applications of third country verifiers. So those are at the moment Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Sweden, but also to operators in the room if you are planning to ensure that the goods that you produced can be reported based on actual values, to reach out to or to scan already for potential verifiers you might want to work with, and encourage them as well to reach out to these national accreditation bodies. And then lastly, and I'm coming now to the end of the presentation as well, the last element of the calculation, this is on the next slide, which is the deduction of the carbon price paid in a third country, applies the same kind of consistency between the reporting based on actual values and the reporting based on default values. Just waiting for the slide to change. This is just to say that currently we are in the process of finalizing the implementing act on the carbon price effectively paid in a third country that will determine also the rules on how an actual carbon price paid can be determined and then deducted. And for this, there's also a consultation procedure open until the 10th of June, where you see the link as well on the slide. And in addition, the Commission will also work on providing default carbon prices that will be made available for countries with a carbon pricing system in place. And that can then be deducted a bit as on a default basis and does not need any certified evidence. But these will also take into account any kind of compensation or rebates in the national systems. Then I think I will try to hurry up a bit for the last parts of the presentation. So just one word on the next slide on the downstream extension, but also happy in case there are any questions to reply to them later, also in the Q&A segment. As mentioned, these were now proposed in December as an extension of the scope of CBAM, notably to aluminium and steel intensive goods. On the next slide, you will see a bit of a list. We have 180 CN codes that are proposed to be added to the scope of CBAM. Most of them are industrial value chain products. A very small share concerns household goods, for example, washing machines, but the biggest share is really tubes, pipes, or certain intermediate products used in metal value chains. And currently this proposal is with the EU co-legislators as part of the amendment to the CBAM regulation. So yeah, depending on or subject to this legislative discussions. And then really lastly, just also as a reminder for on the next slides, we have the CBAM registry. So this is a bit the interface that will allow declarants to submit their CBAM declarations, but there's also a dedicated third country operators portal, which would allow also operators to register on the CBAM registry and then ultimately also share data or emission data, verified emission data with each other, particularly also on precursors. So this was also a response to a request that we have received from third country operators, and this will also now become operational during the definitive periods. I think we can skip the next two slides. They are just reminders of the kind of homework now to do. First thing, or the most important elements maybe to take away. First thing is that all the rules are now being adopted. for operators to start the monitoring of emissions according to the methodology rules, and also to already reach out to verifiers for them to apply also for accreditation, so that we have a bit of a smooth process as well in ensuring that that actual values can be declared. So yeah, also just to say that the Commission is putting a lot of guidance documents as well, and making available guidance documents on verification and on the methodology that will become available on the website. The many thanks also to the European delegation that has compiled a list of resources already available, and that will be shared, I think, after this session. And with this, I will close this presentation and look forward also to your questions and your feedback. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Klaus. This has been a very informative and information-intensive presentation. And I just want to remind everybody in the room and on the online audience that you will receive this presentation, plus a whole lot of more information and resources early next week in the feedback report to this workshop. So there's a lot of takeaways, and all this information is available to you. My colleagues are now putting up some extra chairs on the podium here, or on the stage, in preparation for our panel discussion. And before we even start that, if I may just remind my EU colleagues in the room and remotely to help answer some of the questions that are coming in online on the Zoom text Q&A. It'll be very helpful if you can answer as many of these text questions as possible, so that we can deal with these questions even before the Q&A session starts, and it makes things flow easier and quicker. So with that, I'm going to ask our three panelists to please come forward and take a seat. Don't worry, anywhere will do. And if you can come up the stairs here, don't trip or anything, and grab a seat. There's a microphone available for you on each seat, I believe. And if you can learn how to switch them on, I think there should be a little on button somewhere on them. But before we start this session, I would like to do the formalities and introduce you to our presenters, or our panelists, shall I say. And we have three panelists, as you can see. And the first one who's going to present or speak with a sort of a introductory remarks before we get into the actual discussion is James Mackay, who is from the Energy Council of South Africa, and he's the CEO of the Energy Council. And as the CEO, James leads business engagement to advance energy reform as a cornerstone of economic growth, competitiveness, and job creation. He works closely with government and industry to strengthen energy system reform and investment. With over 25 years of experience across the public and private sectors, including intensive work across Africa, he is professionally qualified in engineering with a Bachelor of Science engineering degree, and also in finance as a chartered accountant registered in South Africa. And he combines both technical depth with strong commercial insight and strategic leadership and experience. Big welcome to you, James. I'm going to call you up to the podium shortly. But before I do that, let me introduce you to Professor Brett Cohen. Brett's over there. You can see his face on the screen as well. Brett has over 25 years experience working in climate and sustainability projects in the energy industry and waste sectors of South Africa and globally, in both academia and the private sector. Brett's work on the European Union CBAM has focused on understanding the exposure of South African industry to CBAM, as well as on the potential role for Power to X to reduce the impacts on industry. Brett is an honorary professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering at UCT, and he holds a Bachelor of Science and PhD in Chemical Engineering from the University of Cape Town, and he's also a consultant with the company Annuity. So thank you and welcome to you, Brett. And lastly, Sanelisiwe Mdlalozi. Commonly, I think you encourage me to call you Sunny because my tongue finds it somewhat difficult to get around your name, but it's Sanelisiwe. I hope I got that right. Sunny for short. Sunny is an environmental sustainability manager, or the environmental sustainability manager in the aluminium manufacturing sector at Hulamin in Pietermaritzburg, and she has more than 25 years experience across industrial manufacturing and risk systems. Her work is focused on the practical implementation of the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, including embedded emissions, reporting, carbon measurement, reporting and verification systems, product carbon accounting, and decarbonization strategy within industrial value chains. Ladies and gentlemen, these presenters have been very carefully chosen, and their presentations, their short introductory remarks, are going to focus on some of this. So I think James is going to look at this from a broad industry perspective, on what CBAM is to this industry broadly in South Africa. Brett is going to focus on some of his work looking at the impacts of CBAM on specific industry segments or sectors. And then Sunny is going to look at her work at Hulamin, a specific company that manufactures downstream aluminium. It's a downstream manufacturer of aluminium products that are exported to the European Union and around the world. So she is, as a company, is directly impacted. So you can see this from a broad industry perspective to the impacts of specific sectors and to how this impacts on a specific company. That's how we've chosen, that's how the European Union have chosen these three presenters. So with that, I'm going to ask James to come forward and give his words of wisdom. Thank you, James.
Chris. Thanks very much, and thanks for that kind introduction, Chris. This is a super complicated topic at a very complicated time. I think energy forms this interweaving thread in a very complicated geopolitical world. And so reflecting on, what do I say here in 5 minutes to meet the expectation that Chris has set, it goes back to a little, how do you eat an elephant? And then they say, well, it's one bite at a time. So I'm going to attempt to do a magic trick and eat an elephant up here quickly in 5 minutes. And so what I was thinking is that, and certainly also I must say, I'm not a tax expert, not a CBAM expert, but we are very deeply embedded in our reform agenda in the electricity space and across the energy space. We work very intensively across both business and government. Importantly, the Energy Councils does not represent a technology or a user group position. Our focus is the energy transition in the interest of South Africa and all South Africans. And so we are continuously focused on looking at implementation. It's very important that we remain neutral in focusing on what is important and in the best interest of the country, and being a trusted partner to work and implement with government. So it's also within that context. So the first sort of factor to consider is that really it's the grid emission factor in South Africa that's high. And this is the sort of, I think, the critical touch point when it comes to considering something like CBAM. If one just reflects that we have a climate bill, we have NDC targets, pretty much I think every corporate that I talk to is committed around decarbonisation, has targets, has sustainability experts and professionals like Sunny who are focusing on this, and we do have a reform agenda in the country that I think everyone understands. So we have policy in place. The ambition is there. So what's not working? How are we going to progress on this? And why is there this threat around CBAM, or perceived threat? So I think that's bite number one. Bite number two, if we kind of peel it back a little bit, the reality is that we're not decarbonizing quick enough. I think one has to reflect there that we don't have clarity on what an integrated reform roadmap implementation looks like in this country. We've moved very quickly from a supply side crisis, and we responded to that supply side crisis with a supply side response. That was hugely successful. Load shedding is, we haven't had load shedding in over a year. And if I go back, and Chris will attest, in 23, 24, when we're saying we think we can solve load shedding, generally the view was we would still be in load shedding through till 27. So in a sense, in the electricity space, we have done what was considered almost impossible. We've moved incredibly quickly, and our reform agenda at the moment is moving. I think I'm very confident and positive. We're doing all the right things. We're progressing in the right areas. Media often portrays a very different picture, and I think it's largely also there's a lot of distrust and a lot of entities are just not at the table where this complexity and level of detail is being trying to work out and implementation is being focused on. So we are seeing now coming together of the integration and reforms, a little bit of improvement in the sequencing. Some things ran ahead, some things stayed behind, and I think things are coming together quite well now. I think that we're actually moving in a very positive, consistent way, and if we just keep going, our reform agenda will keep moving. However, when it comes back to the context that we're discussing here, the pace of retiring coal and developing of new clean tech is not keeping up with the pace of expectation that has been set, and also that is in line with things like carbon tax and CBAM. So this is leaving us adrift, I suppose, in a sense. And then, this really then comes to probably, bite number 3. Well, what really are the problems? Because we're actually in an oversupply position at the moment, and we see this. Really, there's curtailment already in the system on renewables. We've got quite a significant amount of coal generation regularly sitting in cold reserve. So we don't have a supply crisis anymore. What we do have, however, is a cumulative effect of a rundown of economic metrics. So we've seen over probably the last 10 years, debt to GDP has gone from like 50 to 80%. The social bill has gone, increased by 30%. Unemployment's increased by probably 25%. Eskom tariffs have gone up by 900 and something percent. So the affordability thresholds in the economy at the moment are paper thin. Now we look forward and we say, well, what is going to give the headroom for continued investment on the supply side? But now the shift has got to be on system adequacy, balancing, flexibility. How do we start getting that combined with demand? Now, demand is not about confidence. We're seeing growing confidence in the economy, but we're not seeing that converting into fixed capital formation, economic growth, investment. Industrialization and manufacturing is behind. We see lots of promise in data centers, manufacturing in other areas, mining. The investment is not materializing. So demand outlook at the moment remains flat, certainly a lot flatter than, for example, planning documents like the IRP would have indicated. So IRP was built on a 2.3% sort of demand growth. We're actually seeing continued negative growth, and we continued under pressure. We see this in the smelters, trying to recover that, Mozal, automotive industry, steel industry. These are all energy intensive users that are under pressure. So I think that the shift now has got to be, how are we going to, and when can we see these economic metrics starting to really recover that will drive demand? There's no energy transition globally that has been successfully achieved on declining demand. It's that growth in new demand that is the tide that lifts all boats, that creates the headroom, the industrialization for the crossover of technologies and allows the affordability of moving old assets into new assets. That is where our pinch point is at the moment. So we have to kind of get demand, stimulate demand, and part of that is a recovery also of state capacity. Our key state vehicles, we can't bypass the state. They have to be capacitated. Yes, they need to maybe be capacitated in a different way, and there are reform agendas that means that the state is going to play different roles. But a lot of the sort of crisis response was built around sort of centralizing control in government through vehicles like NECOM that is not sustainable. We have to go back to the line authority, the department, the NTCSA, the ISMO, NERSA, Eskom, these must be capable entities, must be fit for purpose, and they must be able to deal with this complex and changing environment. And that's currently not in place. So I think that if we can, shift a little bit of that focus, then we're saying, okay, well, then I think actually CBAM it's just, we've got carbon tax, we've got a lot of things on our agenda and our plate. But if we have confidence in our pace of reform and that pace of decarbonization or change, then CBAM is something that we can deal with. I think the last thing that I would add is that what we have seen, which is very important, probably underemphasized, is the level of collaboration and transparency that has started to grow in the system. I think this starts at the broader, the GNU, which is held together, I think is generally seen as very positive. The business government partnership, which was also sort of born out of crisis in 2023 when we had load shedding, Transnet was in near collapse, and we'd just been put on the FATF grey list and a sort of economic or investment downgrade. That business government partnership continues to meet with the president and all ministers, focused on economic recovery. And it's now going into phase 3. That will be formally announced end of June, championed by the president. And the target there is how is South Africa going to get to 3% GDP growth and create 1 million jobs? That's what we have to do. Now, when we can get into that space, I think CBAM is manageable. But if we're still living in this world of lack of transparency, lack of capacity, a supply side led competition of public versus private, renewables versus coal, we are really going to end up in trouble. And I think CBAM just compounds that. So I'll close by saying maybe, if I had to reflect and say, well, where can, so international finance and international support is very important for South Africa. Where can the EU support us? And this is also areas where we're engaging with DFIs in general. But we need support around industrialization. Where and how will we stimulate that? How can we do more in that space? Where are the pockets of growth that we can move on? Public sector capacity building. We need programmatic approaches to deal with that. We need that right through the top levels, from the department. The regulatory oversight and surveillance is becoming super critical as we start introducing these complex, reform agendas, the market opening, trader rules, wholesale tariffs, vesting tariffs, all of these issues needs a strong regulatory environment, which we currently don't have. We need a lot of kind of support on that. And so I think that if we can, focus on those elements, we can move in the right direction more from a sort of a perspective of opportunity and abundance, because we do have overwhelmingly a lot of opportunities. We have moved mountains. We've done what is seemingly the impossible, but we do now need to kind of keep that momentum, and we need to keep moving. Then I think that, along with many other things, we know that South Africans are always very sort of resilient and make a plan. And I'm sure that we will be able to manage these things. But those are my thoughts. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, James, for those very profound insights. And the need for growth and industrialization is the thing that makes things happen, including dealing with CBAM. I think that's quite a message I took away from your words. So with that, I'd now like to call on Professor Brett Cohen to come forward and give us some insights on the work that he's been doing on the impact of CBAM on different sectors of our economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and good afternoon, everybody.
Before we go,
yes,
I just wanted to take some papers off your hands.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Chris, and good afternoon, everybody. I think, James has already framed it really well. This whole thing is like really like eating an elephant. And the work that I'm going to talk to you now is about other aspects of that elephant, or maybe other parts of that elephant that we need to engage with. So, as Chris has already indicated, the work that I did with colleagues at UCT and DNA Economics, many of them are listening in on the call today, trying to have a look at what are the implications for different products being exported to the EU of implementation of the CBAM. And it's quite critical that word products, because I think a lot of the modeling work, the sort of broad quantitative modeling work that's been done on the implications of the CBAM has taken quite an aggregated and macroeconomic approach to it. So typically these kinds of models will treat whole industries or sectors as a single unit, or maybe break it down into a couple of disaggregated parts, and then have a look at flows of materials into the EU, for example, from the iron and steel sector, or perhaps a couple of products, maybe iron, steel separately, and then also use aggregated emissions data to look at the implications of the CBAM. So that kind of course analysis does have its uses, certainly, and particularly it's been quite widely used when one looks at modeling multiple countries and the interactions between countries and the EU. But the problem is that it doesn't really allow us to drill down in what it means for individuals, individual companies, and individual products that are being exported. So that's what this work set out to do, was to try and get a little bit of that granularity out there, excuse me. So we looked at two pieces of information for this purpose. The first is we just had a look at breaking down the trade data, right? So looking at what's actually flowing into the EU. And the first observation, which is very much in line with what Klaus said, is it's only the iron and steel sector and aluminium that are exposed at this point. We don't export fertilizers or cement in any meaningful numbers to the EU. And in fact, in future, I think our assertion is that any fertilizer production that we have in excess will likely go more locally, and we import cement as well. So it's kind of the continent is going to need those products. It's only the iron and steel and aluminium that are impacted by CBAM. And of course, at this point, those only are impacted by their direct emissions, okay, because the CBAM on both of those industrial outputs are only the direct emissions. And in fact, what we saw was that as a whole, the direct emissions from these two industries in South Africa are fairly similar to the rest of the world. It does vary between individual products, but we're not yet very disadvantaged around direct emissions from next to other exporters to the EU. Of course, as James has already said, as soon as indirect emissions get brought in line with the reviews that we heard about in Klaus's presentation, that's when we start getting significantly disadvantaged in terms of our electricity sector emissions. So, even looking at this trade data, there are different ways one can carve it up, and one can then end up drawing different conclusions depending on what numbers you look at. So if we look at millions of euros of exports from South Africa into the EU, we see that 75% of the export value, net, gross export value, is actually concentrated in three products: in iron ores and concentrates, in ferroalloys, and unwrought aluminium. So one might, looking at that particular figure, say, okay, those are the biggest numbers that might be at risk in terms of the CBAM. But then, another way of carving up this data is to have a look at which products the EU represents the primary export market for, okay? So that's not in terms of millions of euros, but it's actually what percentage of your products are going to then be subject to the CBAM. And there we see a bit of a different picture. Obviously, these still figure, the ones that I mentioned, but we start seeing some of the processed aluminium products becoming exposed. And I'm sure Sana will talk to that as well. But where you start seeing things like aluminium sheets and tubes, for which almost 50% of their exports go to the EU. And other aluminium products also have between 35 and 50% of their export value goes to the EU. And then kind of your iron and steel and many other products come in the 25 to 30% of that value. So that's just another way of kind of shining the light on the exposure to CBAM from an absolute value perspective. And you can carve up this data in many different ways. Then we also did some modeling as well, just to explore what the implications of CBAM could be for different products in terms of reducing the export value to the EU, where we looked at parameters including reduction in demand and as well as diversion to other sources of supply by EU companies. And there we saw some other interesting trends. I mean, we saw, once again, our pig iron and concentrate, so this primary iron stream being significantly affected, sort of somewhere to around 85% reduction in the value of exports to the EU, and other products, sort of 50% reduction in the iron and steel broad industry sector. When one has a look at the aluminium sector, interestingly, the numbers are much lower. The percentages of reductions could be much lower, sort of in the 10s to 20s for certain of the aluminium products. So aluminium powders being the most affected product stream to the EU, followed by various other manufactured products. Of course, once again, I want to reiterate that these numbers are only based on direct emissions. As soon as you start including indirect emissions, then the picture changes significantly. So, Chris, I want to respect your 5 minutes. I just want to give you kind of my take-home message really is that, when trying to understand the impact of the CBAM, we need to look at the product level, and consequently, we need to look at the company level. I haven't even mentioned that, but of course, different producers producing the same product might have different emissions profiles and are likely to. So we need to also drill down to how it could impact different companies. We've already heard in Klaus's presentation, we don't want to default to default values simply because the default values have been set high in order to encourage companies to get their own systems for data collection and verification in place. But so it's critical just to firstly compare apples with apples when you're trying to understand the impact of CBAM on South African exports to the EU, and not necessarily try and abstract these sort of high-level headline messages from these broad macroeconomic studies without interrogating them deeply. And then, very importantly, collecting the data, as much data and having it verified as possible will allow us to not only comply, but also understand the implications for individual products.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. And my takeaways from that is that things are not quite so alarming as one might first think, especially whilst indirect emissions are excluded. But things could get tougher as time goes by, but there's going to be this review taking place in 2027. So maybe there will be some changes, we don't know yet. But also what I've heard from the EU, that there will be no special treatment for South Africa, despite how special we are. Unfortunately, they have to be consistent across the world. And Brett sort of indicated that he's been looking at this at a sector level and at a product level. But now Sunny is going to come and look at this at the company level, at the level of Hulamin, who is a manufacturer that uses aluminium in their manufacturing process and exports products. So it'll be really interesting now to hear very practically how you are dealing with this perceived threat and turning it into an opportunity. Thanks, Sunny.
Thanks, everyone. I still use paper, fortunately. Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for the insights, and that's all important perspective leading up to the section I'm going to discuss. So my point of view is really going to be around the journey again of a manufacturer in the business and navigating the CBAM space. Since it was announced in 2021 through our global scanning on aspects that are likely to affect the business, realize that this is going to be a material risk for the business and we should prepare accordingly. The elephant within Hulamin was also not just resting on me as well, only to bite, acknowledging my colleagues that also helped in the process. So one important thing we had to understand, or at least unpack as an organization, is how does Hulamin fit into the CBAM universe, right? There's critical roles and responsibility as based on the engagement with the markets in the EU. For starters, we are an operator outside of the EU, and we participate in various forms in the EU environment. Number one is the sales of our own products to the market. Having said that, Hulamin did not necessarily declare at customs those products. Those were done via a third-party organization. Obviously, we need to ensure that that organization understands that the responsibility of Hulamin is now being carried through to them as well. So there were engagements to ensure that there's a formal understanding around how those should work. We also have customer importers that we had to satisfy that we do understand there's a legal requirement for us to be able to provide certain information in line with the legal framework. And there was also a lot of engagements to ensure that they understand that we are participating in putting together systems in place to be able to deliver on that. Right. Also acknowledging the fact that obviously we are in South Africa, and the context that you've heard from my colleagues here is also quite important. You don't necessarily just share information with international markets and not try to obviously indicate what the context of the country is, and we will try to do that as much as possible. But in our value chain, we also have a more fortunate outline in that our roots was directly in South Africa as a region, upstream supplier of unwrought aluminium was a single route, and the engagement to ensure they also understood we had a CBAM obligation also became a much more formalized engagement. There's key responsibilities from a precursor perspective, which I'm going to also discuss, that we had to formally let them know they need to understand we need to fit into the CBAM space. So this journey was sustainability led, and essentially we were doing all the interpretation of all the information that Kraus was talking about. And then we started building a governance framework, ensuring that there's compliance, and then there will be integrity around our emission information. Customer interface was probably one of our most critical activity, because there was a lot of Q&A in the process around what is this about? Do you understand? Are you going to provide information, and so on and so forth? And we would just have to have regular meetings to provide a little bit of assurance around the space. And then from an organization perspective as well, we needed to understand what are they trying to do in the EU, and what other existing frameworks are being implemented that we can learn from. So also understanding how the ETS works, because the CBAM was a process that mirrored a ETS system. We sort of started engaging with resources to better unpack and understand that as much as possible. Within the team now, in terms of what we needed to deliver, I was just looking at the questions that are coming through around, but how do you do that? Essentially, of critical importance for us, it was our IT department. The organization can, at any given time, be processing over 1,500 units that are likely to end everywhere else in the world, right? So we needed to build a system that allows us to trace almost everything, every resources that we use to produce a unit that is likely to end up either in the EU or Australia or wherever else in the world. Those systems exist in the production environments, and we had to overlay a sustainability platform to track the energy, to track the non-aluminium. Let me breathe. I'm running out of breath. To track the non-aluminium inputs into the product, And we also a biggest utilizer of scrap in South Africa. We also had to track that inputs and also be able to balance the information to be able to provide more accurate, traceable information within the system. Again, the inputs from a precursor, which is South 32, I mean, it's not a secret from a South Africa perspective. That formal process on how the product is delivered as a liquid aluminum and also as a pig, there's different CN codes, and you need to take those into consideration and then move with your product all the way up to the packing order. And then within the packing order, identify the relevant CN codes and the ability to be able then to deliver your information using the relevant CN codes. Okay, so I don't want to underplay the relevance of MRV systems. I think they are thoroughly underutilized in organizations. The CBAM process is not necessarily just a carbon process. It's an environmental process. It's an energy process. It's a resource management process. And having a properly designed MRV system for any manufacturing organization is just going to be key going forward, right? And it was a key for us as well. So we developed all our models internally. The IT, resource efficiency team, engineering, sustainability, and also logistics from the movement of product element, right? So we essentially could so what I wanted to indicate, which is also of the utmost importance around MRV, is the information was not necessarily going to be designed for CBAM. In a raw material world, you need to provide PCFs, you need to provide EPDs, you need to provide LCAs. We have 3 different methods for us to allocate recycled content for packaging markets and, other relevant calculators that are sometimes determined by customers from time to time. And then other customers require renewable certificates, and all of those need to be managed within the different models to be able to always be able to provide the relevant information as almost as accurate as possible. So we're not necessarily dealing with CBAM as a single deliver, this MRV as a single delivery means for the organization, but to be able to plan an opportunistic strategy that will allow us to have products that are low carbon and they are benchmarked, and we can actually at the end be able to deliver those to the most prominent markets, because you will understand also is less likely for you to be able to to implement change generally across your value chain if it's not necessarily required as yet. And that's what CBAM bought. It just bought all the plans we had in place just forward by like 2 years, to be exact. So from the onset, we then could be able to report on actual emissions. I think we were probably one of the few first companies that could provide the information, actual value emissions. And then we also use the guidelines because it also was already clear what they will be required in terms of verification. Our board and CE said, okay, so we need to also just sense check if our processes will meet the scrutiny based on certain ISO standards, and we were able to do that. The link to logistics is also quite key because, as I mentioned, we don't directly import into the EU. We use a third party for that, and we have to engage with them and also be able to use their process of or formalize how we're able to declare our products at the beginning of the transition period. Again, the feedback from them was probably the first pusher for them to be able to design a system that allowed them to do that. So it was quite key to be able to just formalize and make sure that everyone understood where the deadline were, what the deadlines were, and how the impacts of the business if they're not met. At the same time, the customers will obviously always give you the worst case scenario because they're looking at what they want to manage. So they will always be pushing the lines in terms of what they want us as an organization to be able to produce. So we're at the point now, our rubber has hit the road. We are in a definitive phase. We're looking at the verification processes linked to our actual emission. Again, in the system, there's a whole lot of discussion around deferred values and customers requesting us to demonstrate the fact that we know you have actual emissions, but just tell us for sure you're not going to use default values, because we know financially it's not necessarily going to be viable for anyone to be, transacting in a default value space. So just the opportunities we have in terms of what we're busy with at the moment, engagement with upstream, also ensuring that their supplier information is verified, so that we don't have to use the default values. But interestingly, you'll also appreciate that in our environment, 90% of the embedded emission in our products come from upstream. And from a raw aluminium perspective, they already pay tax. So we need to assume certain tax is indicated so that we're able to model how that liability will be impactful to the organization. And we're still unsure at the moment how we're going to provide verification that the upstream actually did pay tax on the product. And I think it's probably going to be something that is going to be a takeaway from this process, because it's significant. It's 70% of our tax bill is from primary aluminium. We also meeting up with challenges because we do quite a bit of modeling around specific emission free allowances for secondary recycling. It's either too small or too big, but it erodes the benefits of recycling the way it's construed. So we will be sending some comments through so that the team can have a look at that. I know it's easier to benchmark an operation, but it's usually not easy to benchmark a recycling facility. But we're seeing that in the numbers that your recycled material, which should be a benefit, is actually much higher CBAM. And then we're also planning ahead now in terms of, there's a possibility of indirect emission. We're likely to be an operation that receives electricity from the grid, from generators, from on-site solar, from PPA, which we've recently concluded. And then we also have to develop systems to evidence the production during that time so that we can allocate those green elements accordingly into the product to benefit that market. At the same time, trying to preempt as well that although CBAM obviously is not clear within the downstream in terms of what they will require from the upstream, which is ourselves, we're also preparing to be able to indicate some information and how it can be used for their requirement going forward. I think just generally that's what we've been doing for the past 2-3 years.
I think Sunny has kind of brought home the complexity of the task at hand. But what always I admire about her and about Hulamin is how they have rolled up their sleeves and got on with it. Everything from measurement, reporting, verification, the complexities around that, through to the actual decarbonization, how to decarbonize your product, whether it's electricity or other ways in which you can decarbonize your operation. It is a challenge, complex indeed. At this point, I want to give 5 minutes to Klaus in Brussels to find out if he would like to respond to any of these points that have been made by our 3 panelists before we go into the open Q&A. Klaus, I'm going to ask you, we are heavily over time, and in that regard, I have failed. I told you that my job was to keep this on track and on time, and I haven't. But I haven't had the heart to stop the discussion because it's been so important and so intense in information. So I hope you'll forgive me for failing. But Klaus, if I can ask you to keep it as short as possible so we can get the show on the road with the Q&A, but this is your opportunity to respond if there's any issues that you would like to take up. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chris, and no failure at all. I think it was a very great kickoff also with the speakers. Maybe just to say that we also try to reply to some of the questions in Q&A in writing. So yeah, maybe feel free to refer to those. There was one specific that came up a couple of times also on the indirect emission scope and then potential scope extension and also other sectors. I think it was mentioned the refinery products. So maybe just to clarify again, for the moment we retain the same scope in terms of sectors, the 6 sectors, and indirect emissions only for for cement and fertilizers, as well as for agglomerated iron ore as the exception under iron and steel. And reflection is now postponed to 2027 on further extension. And I think Vicente will just briefly say something also on accreditation and verification, as there were also a couple of questions on this.
Thank you, Klaus, and thank you very much also to the 3 panelists. I think it has been a very lively conversation covering a complex issue. I would like to say a few words again on accreditation and verification because there were a number of questions and misunderstandings, and I think it's important that I clarify that. I mean, as you know, there are 2 levels, the accreditation bodies, which are the ones who will accredit the verifiers, which is the 2nd level in the process. Just to be clear, even if you have your own accreditation body in South Africa, which is SANAS, these for the moment cannot accredit any verifiers in South Africa because the CBAM regulation only allows for accreditation to be done and carry on by national accreditation bodies in the EU. I can tell you that so far, 21 EU national accreditation bodies have shown an interest in accreditation of verifiers for CBAM purposes. They already do that, for example, for the EU ETS, for the EU emission trading system. I think we have around 24, so not all member states have one. I think there was a question about Ireland. If I don't remember wrongly, there is no accreditation body in Ireland, so the Irish companies rely on other EU member states. And those who have shown an interest will be available as soon as possible in order to start with the accreditation of verifiers. What I can tell you is that so far 5 of them have already opened the door. So they are waiting for applications from verifiers in order to start with the process of accreditation. Verifiers, this is the 2nd level, can be established anywhere. They can be established in South Africa, but they can be established in the EU. They will have to prepare some sort of dossier in order to get the accreditation from one accreditation body in the EU. You can choose, if you are established in South Africa, you can choose any EU member state. If you have an affinity or better contacts with one specific country, you may ask in Germany, in Spain, in Italy, in France. You don't need to do that in a specific country. What I can also say is that out of the 21, not all of them are in a position of accrediting verifiers in 3rd countries. The number will be smaller. We cannot tell you exactly how many. Out of the 5 that I mentioned before that have already opened, we know that 2 of them are already offering services to verifiers in 3rd countries. And we will publish, we are publishing the list of national accreditation bodies, and we will also publish the list of verifiers, of accredited verifiers on our CBAM website. And there you will find all the information. If you are a verifier in South Africa interested in getting accreditation, as I said, contact one of the accreditation bodies which is open to do that. You have an implementing act and a delegated act that were adopted last year, which are on our website, that provide you the requirements, the process, the procedures, the documentation that you need to prove to the NAB, to one of the NABs in the EU member states in order to get the accreditation. If you are already verifying emissions, for example, for the carbon tax in South Africa, for any other purposes, and you already comply with ISO standards for verification, what I can tell you is that that will, of course, accelerate the procedure. So I'm not going to say that one is tantamount to the other. I think there was a question saying, I'm already accredited by SANAS. Why do I need to be accredited also by an EU NAB? Because CBAM is something new, it's a different procedure with a specific methodology, and we require to go through this process. I will tell you also that EU verifiers that already are accredited for the EU ETS, they also have to undergo the process, and they also have to specifically and explicitly ask for an accreditation for CBAM purposes. So it's not automatic either for EU verifiers under the EU ETS. Last point. I don't know if there is someone from SANAS in the call. SANAS is a member of the new Global Accreditation Corporation Incorporated. They inherited, or they followed the previous International Accreditation Forum, so you are a member of that one. That facilitates many things. SANAS may have a role to play in order to help verifiers in South Africa to contact with NABs in the EU and also to get prepared. We are doing this with a number of countries, I can tell you, I will be open with you. And also, we know that some accreditation bodies in the EU, and I would like to underline that, are the ones responsible of the accreditation of verifiers. They are very much interested in cooperating with the local or with the national accreditation bodies in third countries in order to conduct part of the review of the applications of verifiers. So if you are in SANAS, you are interested in cooperating, helping with CBAM implementation, get in touch with one NAB, 2, 3 NABs in the EU who are interested in accrediting verifiers in South Africa, and you can be an intermediary. You can, of course, facilitate the process and make sure that there will be a sufficient number of verifiers. I think this is a very important point. We don't know how many installations in South Africa are interested in verification of their emissions. We can anticipate that we expect a good number. I think it would be a pity that we delay, we don't hurry up, we don't rush with this, and that there are no possibilities, or it will become difficult for companies in South Africa to find verifiers. Let me underline as well that the verifiers do not need necessarily to be in South Africa. They can also be verifiers already established in the EU. I think that the fact that you speak English and the documentation can be English also can be easy, can help a lot with the process. This could be more cumbersome or difficult in other countries. But of course, feel free whether you prefer to rely on verifiers in South Africa or verifiers in Europe. But please, don't delay, start as soon as possible. This is a call on verifiers. This is a call on you as exporter, but this is also a call on SANAS to help. We are happy to have a meeting with SANAS and some verifiers, and a specific webinar where we will bring also our experts on accreditation and verification in order to clarify and also to see how we can help, how we can work with you for the future. I think there were questions about the cost. I have no idea. I mean, that's something that you will need to discuss with the exporter. With the verifiers. I understand that maybe at the beginning could be more costly because there is a whole process of checking. They have to go on the site and they have to control a number of things. And possibly the second, third, fourth year, things become a bit more recurrent, and maybe the cost also will be lower. The verifier will have to issue a verification report. The verifiers will be connected with our CBAM registry, as exporters can already do that, and everyone will be able to share information through this CBAM registry. So for example, if you export in South Africa, you verify your emissions by, let's say, a verifier in South Africa. The report can be uploaded in this CBAM registry, and you can give access, you exporter can agree to give access to all your importers in the EU so that they can rely on those values and you don't need to share information offline with each of them. I mean, we are setting up this process so that we can also help, of course, with the implementation and with the practical issues. So that's what I can say on accreditation verification. I hope I clarify as much as possible. But as I said before, I think that maybe accreditation verification deserves a very specific meeting with the experts in the area. And I think that there are ways to cooperate and, of course, to make sure that we are able to reach out. If someone, maybe Sanas, could also map the needs of verification in South Africa, that would also help us a lot to understand how many installations are in the need for that. And again, we are happy to, of course, to support and to make sure that verification will be available as soon as possible. Thank you. That's all I wanted to say about accreditation and verification.
Thank you, Vicente. For that, I'm trying to switch on my microphone, but it doesn't seem to want to. No, this one is not on. Should I switch it on? Let me try. Now, am I on? Yes, sort of. Thank you, Vicente, for answering, I think, quite a lot of questions in your response, questions that came up in the text Q&A. In particular, a lot of questions around measurement, reporting, and verification, accreditation. Seems to me that there is an opportunity for verifiers in South Africa to become accredited. No, they cannot get accredited by SANAS. You have to do it through a member country of the European Union. But I think it's an important opportunity for people in the verification space to get accredited, as Vicente said, as soon as possible, if you want to take advantage of this opportunity. We're now going to move on to this sort of fireside chat, you might say, on a cold winter's day. And I've got these panel experts in front of me. They've given us really some important information, but I'd like to pose a couple of questions to each of it. And first of all, to James. James, you looked at the big picture. What do you think? And in a way, I think you did answer it, but just to recap, what is or are the biggest CBAM challenges facing South African industry? What are the big ones that the challenge? I think you talked about economic growth, getting ourselves into gear, because without growth, very little can happen. But can you just elaborate a little bit on what kind of challenges are the big ones?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, there we go. I think if I just sort of think a little bit through this, top down, the first one is going to be the economic metrics. We really are, it's sort of in a precarious position. And yes, okay, CBAM is there, but we need to find a way through this around growth. We need to consolidate the gains and the sort of the wins that we have had from an economic perspective. But if we look forward, and particularly then I reference indirect emissions through the emissions grid factor. We don't currently have a plan on the table to decommission coal before 2030. That's the earliest that we're currently looking at. And even that is going to be very challenging because it's a very complex environment of social, labor, community, financial, technical. There are many, many factors here. As I said, we are actually in an oversupply position, which actually the pressure comes back on affordability and system adequacy. So we have to deal with that in order to get confidence that we actually are decommissioning the system, decarbonizing the system. So that decarbonization pace, I think, is the priority. I will just say underneath that, and I've just recently also participated in a World Bank event where they are looking at their country strategy for the next 5 years. A key theme that came up, and this was both from observation of the World Bank as well as the representatives sort of in the workshop, is that the cost of doing business in South Africa has just got more and more and more. The regulatory environment, the red tape, the hurdles is very, very onerous. Unfortunately, this is another one of those things, and you can hear the level of complexity and cost and intensity of having to deal with this. We do need to find a way to simplify the regulatory environments and the kind of administrative burden on business if we want things to grow.
Thanks, James. Yeah, and I think the message you got also from the EU is that they are also looking at how to simplify these processes because it is burdensome, especially on smaller companies. And I think we should be happy that they have in fact exempted companies from reporting obligations if they're exporting less than 50 tons per annum. And that impacts thousands, literally thousands of smaller businesses. To you, Brett, look, we know that decarbonisation costs money. It's expensive. The question is, how can companies decarbonise with all the costs involved and still remain competitive? Because ultimately, that's what they have to be, is they have to be competitive, not just in the European Union, but globally. So my question is perhaps a trick question. How can you decarbonize at cost while still remaining competitive? Sorry to throw this at you.
Yeah.
But you're an academic with a professor. You know these things, I guess.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, is that working?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
okay. I mean, that is a bit of a trick question, and we go back to the elephant analogy, I think, is that I think we've got sort of it's a multifaceted approach that companies need to take. And I think there are small gains that many companies have already made in terms of decarbonization, just in response to many of the energy pressures, that James has already spoken to, energy efficiency, looking at self-supply of renewables or some sort of PPA arrangements, which are responses more in terms of ensuring energy security and cost reduction than necessary decarbonization, but they do come with decarbonization benefits. The big challenge is the decarbonization of kind of large industrial assets. And I think there's kind of an increasing understanding that decarbonizing these big assets is no mean feat. So, when we look at some of the policy that's being developed in South Africa, it says, these are the sectoral emissions targets, and such a sector must decarbonize at this rate. Or, we allocate carbon budgets, and it's kind of a lot of top-down policy, but that actual process of decarbonizing a large industrial asset, which is deeply embedded in a value chain. So it's reliant on upstream suppliers. It is responsible for downstream supply to many different sectors and downstream users of their products, is not easy. So there's no single solution. It's obviously facility and industry dependent. But I think the important thing is to recognize that it's not a kind of a can that you can kick down the line any longer. We've got not only the CBAM and the international pressures and market pressures and that sort of thing, but also the local legislative and regulatory pressures, which are increasingly going to drive that decarbonization agenda. So I think it's early exploration of opportunity in the relevant sector.
Thanks, Brett. Sanalisiwe, we've heard about, how complex this is and how you are stepping up to the plate to deal with it. But can I ask you what kind of support you think you need from the South African government and from industry associations like the Energy Council and others, the Energy Intensive User Group, for which you're a member of that association? What kind of support do you need from the South African government and industry associations? And what kind of support do you need from the European Commission, from their side, in order to make your job a little bit easier?
I sort of want to start by understanding how complex all of this is for them. But again, we've been talking about the elephant analogy and the fact that it has to start somewhere. I think the appreciation of the fact that we need to decarbonize has grown, monthsfold in, since I started with decarbonization work. But what is important, I think, from our South African government, so we're dealing with three departments at the moment. So the TIC, DFFE, SARS falls under, yeah. But it is unclear directionally where they want to go, and how does it help us to continue to manufacture and provide to the economy of South Africa. We understand the need to claim taxes, we understand the need to report, but we don't understand what they're trying to do to support industrialization, right? I think it would be quite opportune. Maybe I don't see it. I also want to speak for myself, but it gets very frustrating to deal with three departments and you actually do not see alignment. There is a PCC indication that there will be single point of accountability or authority, but somebody that's supposed to coordinate at some level that hasn't come into being. We don't know how that ought to work, but it will be great to essentially really understand where are going to be the nodes of energy development in the green space going to be. Where is the country going to be focusing to do any aspects of industrialization or decarbonization, so that there is a map that everyone is aware. If I'm growing the business or if I'm shutting down or whatever skills and opportunities there are in this industry, which are there, is really supposed to concentrate itself in to grow the manufacturing industry. I think with the EU, there's obviously two things. One, I'm going to appreciate the fact that the legal pack that we've been working through, obviously I will comment on it as a professional. I just could see what they were thinking about. And if we had any questions and we needed to be certain aspects of the legal framework to be contextualized so that it drives something, you could see that it was considered and the response came back. And that was over a period of 2 years. That pack came out and, the rules were developed. We struggle and sort of to get the rules that guide legally how we're just going to get things done and get the traction to be able to just get the pace to do the work. It is a little bit frustrating because there's so much to learn from. And I don't know how we're going to unbundle from that. And then from a CBAM element as a tool, again, it's we initially had a discussion around the fact that certain changes actually really do close certain markets in some of the regions. We are still concerned about the emission factor in our grid relative to other grids all over the world. And yeah, so to continue to serve certain markets is really going to be difficult under those conditions, right? A part of South Africa felt like we just structurally cannot do this. Understandable, we were not given time to do it. 2 years is almost over. It's a little bit frustrating that it's not as flexible as we'd want it to be. I suppose that would be the bear about the situation, but again, within the context of it's an international law, it's not specifically supposed to benefit the country over another country. Also, we get that. There's that, yeah. Yeah.
No, I think you have indicated, the three aspects from the role of the South African government to try and coordinate and have a consistent, coordinated, rational policy framework that is consistent is important. And as you say, dealing with three different departments that are not always on the same page generates some frustration. James, please come in here.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I would just would like to talk a little bit also again, because energy policy and industrial policy needs to now be hardwired going forward.
Coordinated.
And a very practical example, we look at the TDP, everyone will know it's a sort of a 440 billion capital program, originally over 10 years. We've now kind of compressed that because, again, we have these delays. And now we're starting to see this peak and trough type of investment scenario. And we see these disconnected policy environments where, ITAC is coming out and saying we're going to implement import taxation. And industrial policy is not connected to energy policy. So this integration is really critical. The other area where the EU is very strong, and again, I think the environment is very receptive to this more mature conversation, where I think a lot in the past, there just wasn't an opportunity to have that. We were in such deep crisis across politics, load shedding, all of these elements, that a lot of these conversations were not really possible. I think that the landscape and the environment is significantly more mature than it was even 2 years ago. And we do now need to have a much more structured approach to a holistic program of how we get through this next 3 to 5 years. If we can do that successfully to sort of 2030, 31, we really are through this kind of implementation period in the transition. We've got the new establishments. We've got a solid system and market operator. You've got an independent transmission company. You've unbundled your generation. You've got a competitive market. We're moving in the right direction. Price signals, all of these elements are settled. Now, really, if we can get there, but we need growth to be able to get us through this period. And I think, the EU really can play a very strong role in helping to, create a more holistic approach towards CBAM. And lastly, I also just would say there are technical elements within that. There are significant upgrades around grid codes and the technicalities of how we're going to introduce digital inertia, data centers, large mega loads that can switch off and on in like milliseconds. These are things that we have to be able to navigate as part of the growth agenda. We don't have the skills and capability and institutions in place to do this as it stands now, but we must do it. And so I think this is an opportunity where we can broaden and deepen the conversation with the EU on the back of CBAM must be implemented. And I think that the environment is conducive for it.
And I think the role that the Energy Council has played in the connection between business and government has produced significant results in the electricity and generation sector. And I'm optimistic, that with your role that you can drive this through, to the wider decarbonization activities and the investment, this collaboration between business and government. In some countries like China, business and government work very closely. In South Africa, there's a tension, a distrust between government and business that is not helpful. We're not always working together. And as you say, there's a lot to be done, and I'm sure the European Union has a role to play in the wider issues, not just CBAM. But, I would like to have continued this discussion on the panel longer, but I've been told we have to now move on because we're running so late. But we're going to now go to the audience, to you, the audience, and ask you to put up your hand. Now, I'm going to also look online, if I can get this right. Yes, so people online, if you want to put up your hand, we can go to you. If you've got a specific question that you'd like to ask verbally. Look, there's been a lot of questions that have been asked in text form. Quite a lot of them have been answered, and Klaus and Vicente has also answered some of those in their presentation. But from you, the audience in this room, please put up your hand. One of our ladies will come and give you a microphone. I see somebody in the corner there. Please just wait until you've got the microphone in your hand, because then it gets broadcast to our remote audience. And if you can, of course, introduce yourself, your name, and where you come from, so we know, what context you are coming from. Please, can you ask your question, and we'll put that to one of our panelists or to our people in Brussels.
Yeah, Prince Mkonto from Glencore Ferro Alloys. Thank you. Just two quick questions. One's for Vicente. If he can elaborate on the point that he mentioned that the domestic carbon tax, it required to be certified to be recognized for CBAM. If you can just elaborate on that, please. And the second point, I just need clarity. If we use a company level emission factors and we consider the cost associated with a carbon tax locally, are we able to use the default emission values for CBAM? Thank you.
Thank you. And let's put that to Vicente. Can you respond to that question? I hope you heard it loud and clear. I think to some extent you have covered both of those aspects, but Glencore is a major, ferrochrome and producer, and I'm sure these issues are heavy on their mind. Vicente, can you come in here?
Yeah, no, sure. Thank you. Thanks a lot for the question, because I think we didn't cover sufficiently this point. I mean, if a carbon tax has been paid at the source, in this case in South Africa, this carbon tax can be deducted. But in order to be deducted, it has to be also certified, not verified. We talk about verification of emissions, but we talk about certification of the carbon tax, and that will have to be done by someone, not necessarily the verifier of the emissions. It could be someone else, but there will also be a process for this certification. And this is precisely what we are describing, plus other things. We are describing in this implementing act, which was launched in public consultation 2 weeks ago, and that we referred to it before at the very beginning of the session this afternoon. So I think that if Klaus, if you didn't do it, maybe you can put in the in the chat also the link to the consultation, yeah, because I think that would be very relevant. There in the consultation, in the public consultation, you will find information about who can certify the carbon tax, what type of carbon tax, I mean, that should not be a problem for South Africa, and also how this carbon tax will translate into a number of CBAM certificates that the importers do not need to buy. I would like to make another point. That's in the case that you want to certify a specific carbon price, carbon tax paid in South Africa. We are also working, and I think this is very relevant for everyone, on default carbon prices, not to be confused with default values or default emissions. The idea is that by the end of the year, hopefully by September, but I don't want to commit to that, we will come with a list that will be updated every year, which will say we take for any exporter in this country, because we know your carbon tax, we will deduct this amount per tons of CO2. So for example, I mean, I don't remember now because I knew there were plans to increase your carbon tax, but if we come to the conclusion, for example, that the effective carbon, nominal and effective carbon tax per ton of CO2 in South Africa is 2 euros, let's say, in conversion, in that case, we will deduct automatically without the need to certify the exact carbon price. We will deduct 2 euros translated or transformed into a number of CBAM certificates. We will deduct directly when these goods are imported from South Africa. I hope I managed to explain that. So there will be two possibilities to declare emissions, actual emissions and default values. As one of the panelists also said, they are very high, or I think maybe Chris said they are very high. And there will be also two possibilities for the carbon price. Either you certify that you exactly pay that carbon price, and these are the rules which are in public consultation, or you can rely on the list of default carbon prices that we will release at the end of the year. And in that case, you don't need to do much. Once you know that the goods come from South Africa, You look at the list, I mean, the importer will look at the list and they will deduct that amount directly. You can combine. If you declare actual emissions, you can also declare a specific or actual carbon price, or you can rely on the default carbon price. However, if you rely on default values for the emissions, you absolutely only can rely also on the default carbon price. So no, the two possibilities are not available at the moment. I hope I managed to explain myself. I'm happy to clarify something was not clear.
No, I think that's clarified to his satisfaction from the hand I see from him. I would, before I come to you over there, if I may take a question or two from our online audience, and then I will certainly come to you over there. And I see a hand up here as well. We're going to come to you, I promise you. But I'd like to address this one to James. There are two questions, James, both quite similar. One is from Louis de Beer, who says the following, and really to try and to make sure we are understanding you correctly, James. Am I understanding James correctly? Fundamentally, South Africa just doesn't have the economic ability to deal with the EU CBAM. Is that what you're saying, James? I'm not sure that it is what you're saying at all. But that's the question which I'd like you to answer to Louis. And a similar vein, Ronald Ragashoa asks the question, taking into account James's comments about the grim macroeconomic outlook, what measures are being explored to protect jobs in these industries? Are you keen to answer this, James? I hope so.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, this is the hard reality that we have to deal with. As I said earlier, I think we've done incredibly well and dealt with a supply side crisis and a supply side response. Load shedding was basically a forced credit extension. So Eskom just spent money on fixing power stations. Private sector extended their balance sheet and bought renewables. Okay, but it wasn't done in an integrated reform program that was well sequenced and thought about the risk and the capacity gaps around implementation. So we've done with that phase. We're now in the implementation, and what we are seeing is what's coming together is the sequencing. However, the transition is expensive, as you said. The decarbonization is not for free. If we are going to, there's a different scenario of saying we have a structured plan and a managed decommission of coal as we grow the economy and demand comes online, and that headroom initially is taken up on clean tech and particularly wind, solar, and batteries. And then you've got a natural progression as you take coal out of the system. If there is no growth and we've got extended coal and we want to accelerate decarbonization, well, then it becomes a one-to-one an asset trade-off. And you're saying, okay, well, we need early decommissioning or just take coal out of the system and replace it with a different asset base. That costs. Someone's going to have to pay for it. If it doesn't, if it's not covered by consumers, it goes to the tax base. So we've overestimated, and for a long time we've always said, and this is not also uncommon. I mean, we've seen the story about Africa rising, Africa growth, and it's now crunch time. There is no affordability left in the system, and this goes to the point of jobs, of low-income households. We've seen, in many areas, this has been a big focus also of the department. They are saying we need to extend FBE, we need to, address a number of issues which are affordability-related issues. But someone's got to pay, and so CBAM is just another layer of that. And so it's not pushing back against CBAM and decarbonization. As I said earlier, we have the policy, we have the sort of the legislation in place, so the ambition is there. But we have to work incredibly hard as a country to build investor confidence and mobilize money. I think the opportunity is that corporate South Africa is sitting on record cash flow levels in the bank. Yeah. I mean, recent numbers is 1.9 trillion of corporate savings. That needs to not be in the bank. It needs to be in the ground and building businesses, companies, and manufacturing and industrialization. Otherwise, we are in trouble. And then CBAM is maybe the sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back. But we do have opportunities. We are moving in the right direction. We must be consistent and keep going. Yeah. And I think we'll get there. So I certainly don't think that anyone should be panicking, but we do need to be very focused and we do need to be practical about we have to solve some complicated problems, and we have to keep, the system together. That's what's important.
Yeah, and I think that's clear. James is not saying that we're in such a bad state that we can never deal with CBAM. He's saying that there's a lot that we have to do and that we can do, and we have to mobilize and we have to work hard, like we worked hard with the electricity and load shedding crisis. There were many doomsayers out there at the time, but the reality is we can do it. And there was why should we not be able to run an electricity system without load shedding? The rest of the world seems to be able to do it. There's every reason why we can do it. And I think it's the same with CBAM. We've just got to roll up our sleeves like Sunny has done at Hulamin and get on with the job at hand. And as you say, James, there is money out there, lots of it, looking for good investments. And we just got to make sure that our policies are consistent and rational and working together. Yeah, please.
Yeah, and I think the one hard thing that we do need to look at is the current level of the carbon tax, because obviously what is paid in terms of the CBAM, again, to reiterate what's been said, is the differential between the EU price and our local carbon price. And if we're looking at sort of upwards of 80 euros a ton is the current price, and we're paying somewhere around two.
Yeah.
So the rest of that money is going offshore. So to get the cash flow in the system, we need to make sure that we're not seeing those revenues going.
Well, I'm aware that that this matter is going to be looked at going forward, even today by one of our next speakers. So I think the road ahead, there is some interesting things in the road ahead. Okay, so I just want to get back to Vicente or Klaus.
Great.
Okay, so this is, shall we make this the last question? It's an easy one. Okay, fine. Okay. This is a less than a 5-minute question. Axel Boudson says, is there a list of any accredited verifier or future accredited verifier that can verify companies in South Africa, whether this is a South African company or an overseas company? Is there any verifier registered anywhere that can accredit and verify a South African manufacturer? Klaus or Vicente, can you answer that? And then we'll close this.
Thanks for this question, and good to see the anticipation also of the verification and verifiers being available. So as mentioned already before, we are now working with the national accreditation bodies, and they're only now opening the application procedures. So we work with them very closely in order to ensure that there will be more application processes open. We mentioned already that a few of them already signaled also openness for non-EU based verify applicants, but we don't at the moment have a list of those accredited verifiers as of now. But this year is really, or the next months are really the months of application and reaching out to those.
We will be transparent. There are no verifiers accredited yet, unfortunately. I mean, accreditation is open, but of course that takes some time. We hope that by September there will be the first accredited verifiers, and then the intention, of course, is to include a list of those verifiers on our website to facilitate things, and also for the publicity and marketing of these companies.
Yeah,
thank you. Front runners will get most of the market. That's clear.
Thank you, Klaus. And that, I think, gives you an indication of the opportunity for verifiers out there. Get yourself together and get going. Look, I would have liked to go on much longer, but they tell me that time is up and I've overrun and failed in my timekeeping. But I would like to invite Caroline Texier from the EU delegation in South Africa to come forward and give us her insights and some comments, and also explain the way forward in this complicated process. Thank you, Caroline.
Is this working? Yes. Thank you so much. So thank you to everyone for today, for this event. So thank you, Chris. Indeed, on timing, we did not manage, but your transition has been impeccable as usual. Thank you to the speakers, Zane, Brett, and James, for your very rich insights, showing a very different picture of what CBAM means in South Africa. Thank you for the TaxSud colleagues online, Vincente, Klaus, Sam, and other colleagues also active in the chat. Maybe just to say that this team engages around the world all the time, explaining CBAM, providing information, helping people implement CBAM. Also, thank you to the organizers, Mirabel, Flor, Ashley, and thank you also to Zale, my colleague, who has done a lot of the heavy lifting. She's right there. Thank you, Zale. Very good. Thank you also to all of you being present here today and all of you being online. Thank you for having posted so many questions in the chat. Why is it important? Because it helps us identify where we need to communicate more, where we need to communicate better, and what information needs to be more out there. And I think today, if we take just maybe two takeaways, one is about MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification. We have talked about it extensively. You will need it to secure proper data and evidence on your emissions to be able to communicate actual verified emissions. And as a next exchange, the EU delegation would like to organize maybe more engagement around that question. So if you are a verifier or you always wanted to become a verifier for CBAM, please find me at the break. I would be very happy to engage for future events. Then another message today, and I'm so sorry I had to interrupt Brett. I was just trying to say that the colleagues from DigiTax would have to leave, but he was making the best point. It's about how the South African carbon tax can be used to keep the revenue generated domestically instead of having it go to the EU through CBAM. With a strong carbon tax, strengthening it, making it effective, raising the rate and no compensation or rebates, etc. It means that what the EU would get would stay in South Africa. And then the debate is how do you want to reinvest it to support, decarbonization of the industry, etc. So it's a debate that we need to have. And once again, I'm raising the opportunity to comment to the consultation we have opened until 10th of June. I think my colleagues have put the link in the chat. If not, we will follow up in the links we will send. Please read, share, comment about this consultation. CBAM is, sometimes portrayed negatively, but CBAM is not about the money it generates for the EU. It's definitely an industrial tool to decarbonize. And this can be shown in the fact that we're supporting countries to strengthen the carbon tax and to keep the revenue domestically. And finally, maybe let's keep in touch. We have had a series of events over the past 2-3 years on CBAM, identifying where we need to discuss more, better to support the implementation. So we will follow up after this workshop with a list of links where you can find information, guidance, frequently asked questions, e-learning tools that are online already on the CBAM website, but that are directly addressed to third country operators. There is a CBAM newsletter. Feel free to stay in touch. And maybe very last words to conclude, and this I take over from James in a way. I heard a lot of passion around CBAM. So when I arrived in the country, I think maybe people would have, thrown like rotten tomatoes at me or something like this. It was a very difficult topic to discuss. And today I heard a lot of very concrete questions, technicity, a lot of knowledge around the table, some sharing of experience on how we have started really working on it and engaged a lot. And, this makes me quite confident that we're moving a bit away from the passion into more of the technical discussion towards maybe, a more decarbonized future, which is the goal at the end of the day for CBAM. And now, because I don't have the talent of Chris for transition, I have no transition to say, let's go for a drink, and happy to continue engaging. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and sorry that we've overrun, and there were a couple of questions we couldn't take. Really sorry about that, but let's talk over a drink and a snack. There's still plenty of time to engage and talk and ask questions and to follow up, and I know that the EU is available. All these questions that came in today are going to be put to the EU, and they can respond to them, over the course of the next few days. Look out for the feedback report, and see you around the table for a drink. Cheers.